When I say the word feminism, what do you think of? You may think of the suffragettes, their fight for the right to vote, or Emmeline Pankhurst. You may think of second-wave feminism, reproductive rights, workplace equality, and the fight for bodily autonomy. Perhaps you think of more recent examples, like the Me Too movement and the fight against sex-based violence. You may have even read some feminist literature, The Female Eunuch, The Second Sex, or The Feminine Mystique. No matter what you thought of, I'm sure something came to mind. The big figures or events we hear about or study. What if we're missing something in our collective understanding of feminism? A group that have always been there fighting alongside their sisters. A group that is so often made invisible or pushed aside. A group that has been shunned or turned away from the feminist movement and has had to find their own community. This group? Lesbians.
And I realized that what these people really wanted was to take my 5'2" little girl and treat her just like a man.
This is Phyllis Schlafly, a prominent conservative activist and lawyer, but she is best remembered for her vehement opposition to the feminist movement in the 1970s and 1980s. A staunch critic of the Equal Rights Amendment, she argued that it would erase gender-specific protections for women and destabilise traditional family structures. For Schlafly, feminism wasn't just misguided, it was a deliberate attack on family values. Central to her rhetoric was the claim that the ERA was a lesbian plot. She insisted that feminists, particularly lesbian feminists like Audre Lorde, Adrienne Rich and Barbara Smith, sought to normalise homosexuality, thereby undermining the nuclear family. In speeches and writings, she conflated feminism with man-hating and same-sex desire.
The woman in the workforce is insanely jealous of that. And she wants to abolish, she can't have a wife of her own, so she wants to abolish the wife of the man.
In her eyes, they were existential threats. Her activism aligned with groups like the Moral Majority, a powerful faction of the Christian right that portrayed LGBTQ+ rights and feminism as moral crises. This fear of lesbian influence, though, wasn't new. In Britain, early anti-suffrage campaigns had similarly dismissed suffragists as unwomanly and dangerous to social order. By the late 20th century, figures like Mary Whitehouse amplified these tropes, rallying against the promotion of homosexuality in media as a symptom of national decline. The pinnacle of this backlash was Section 28, which banned schools from promoting homosexuality, a policy that institutionalised discrimination under Thatcher's government. Even within feminism, lesbians were marginalised. Betty Friedan, leader of the National Organisation for Women and author of The Feminine Mystique, initially ignored lesbian issues, fearing they would alienate mainstream women. By 1970, her reluctance turned to outright hostility when she labelled lesbians the Lavender Menace, a faction she accused of hijacking feminism with radicalism. To her, lesbian inclusion could mean the failure of feminism.
But they were isolated. They were isolated from the mainstream. We could only begin to do something about it when we organized. We had to organize our own groups, our own organizations, and we had to organize them about facing...
The result was a double erasure. Lesbians were vilified by conservatives and sidelined by feminists. What united both groups was the belief that lesbian visibility endangered traditional society, whether as a threat to the family or the movement's respectability. A group of lesbians decided it was time for change. May 1970. It began like any other feminist conference. The agenda, the speeches, the workshops, the meetings. The typical discussions of equal pay and childcare. After a long day of discussion, the conference was about to end, until a group of lesbians plunged it into darkness. When the lights returned, the stage was theirs. It was immediately clear who they were. The Lavender Menace. Their t-shirts adorned with their newly reclaimed title, holding signs and chanting, "We are all lesbians, your worst nightmare, your best fantasy." Martha Shelley took the microphone. Now needs to stop pretending lesbians don't exist. The feminist movement could no longer ignore the plight of lesbians. Months earlier, the New York Times had dismissed them as the lavender herring, a distraction from the proper issues of feminism. So the lesbians of New York claimed this insult and turned it into their revolutionary identity. In a small East Village apartment, they made t-shirts, stole the slogan, and plotted. Their weapon was attention. The Menaces could no longer beg for their issues to be heard. They had to take decisive action. As the leaders of the conference scrambled to get back to their meeting, the audience watched. Some horrified, some enthralled. Carla J shouted from the crowd, "I'm tired of being in the closet because of the women's movement." For the first time, straight feminists had to ask, who was really afraid of who? Their discomfort, both physical and mental, was clear. One witness wrote, "They insisted that the bright lights be kept on. This appeared to reflect a mistrust among the women of their gay sisters." This discomfort, though, eventually became change. By 1971, now passed a resolution. Lesbian rights were feminist rights. Knowing that the Lavender Menace will strike again anywhere, anytime, any place, feminists were finally unable to avoid the issue they had been ignoring, attacking, and minimising for so long. The Lavender Menace, though, wasn't created in a single moment in time. There was a long history of lesbian groups and activists before them, many of whom were also active in the Gay Liberation Front. While we have so far examined how lesbians were portrayed by outsiders, it is crucial to examine how they organised, wrote about, and defined themselves. In San Francisco, 1955, Phyllis Leon and Del Martin founded the Daughters of Bilitis. The group took their name from Pierre Louis' 1894 poem, Songs of Bilitis, which featured a fictional lesbian contemporary of Sappho. In the oppressive McCarthy-era gay persecution, the DOB operated as a secret social club for the protection and organisation of lesbian activists. The organisation's 1955 charter outlined 4 key goals. 1. Education, challenging stereotypes about lesbians through public discussions. 2. Advocacy, fighting for legal reforms, including decriminalising homosexuality. 3. Community, providing safe spaces when lesbian bars were raided and same-sex marriage was not a possibility. 4. Research, collaborating with researchers like Evelyn Hooker to combat the medicalisation of homosexuality. The DOB's magazine, The Ladder, became the first nationally distributed lesbian publication in the United States. While covering various issues, it particularly focused on lesbians' role in the feminist movement. The DOB dissolved in the 1970s as more radical groups emerged after Stonewall, but its model for organised LGBT activism still influences groups today. Founders Phyllis Leon and Del Martin made history again in 2004 when they became the first same-sex couple legally married in California. Formed in 1970 following the Lavender Menace protest, the radical lesbians became a collective force against systemic exclusion. Their main goals in their activism were challenging the Gay Liberation Front's male-dominated leadership, NOW's initial refusal to address lesbian issues, and mainstream feminism's avoidance of lesbianism. Their 1970 manifesto, The Woman-Identified Woman, was revolutionary in the activism of lesbian feminists. It argued that a lesbian was any woman who centred women emotionally, physically, and politically. The manifesto's core critique that heterosexual feminists were quote-unquote sleeping with the enemy caused great uproar and debate within mainstream feminism. They had several core radical principles. 1. Separatism, creating women-only spaces to avoid male influence. 2. Lesbian feminism. They viewed it as feminism's most radical and pure form. 3. A rejection of any masculine-feminine dynamics in relationships, including butch-femme relationships. Ultimately, their rhetoric was a defining force in the lesbian feminist movement. Some of their most famous quotes are, "A lesbian is the rage of all women condensed to the point of explosion," and "Feminism is the theory, lesbianism is the practice." The radical lesbians' uncompromising stance forced feminism to confront its own heteronormativity. In the early 1990s, as debates over race, sexuality and education raged across New York, the Lesbian Avengers emerged as a radical activist group which took to the streets to protest and inform. Their formation was a direct response to two pivotal moments. The brutal 1989 murder of Yusuf Hawkins, a black teenager killed by a white mob in Bensonhurst, which brought attention to New York's systemic racism. And the growing backlash against the LGBTQ inclusive school curriculum, where books like Daddy's Roommate and Gloria Goes to Pride were denounced as, quote, dangerously misleading lesbian and homosexual propaganda by conservative critics like Mary A. Cummins. Frustrated by the lack of meaningful change, playwright Anna Simo gathered a coalition of activists, including Maxine Wolfe and Sarah Schulman, to form a group that would move beyond rhetoric and into the streets. Their founding principle was, quote, no more talking, no community. The point was to do something on the street. True to this idea, the Avengers became known for their inventive, media-driven protests designed to shock, charm, and provoke. One of their most iconic actions came in 1992 with their back-to-school campaign in Queens, where members arrived at a local school wearing t-shirts that read, quote, I was a lesbian child, distributed lavender balloons, and invited parents and students to openly ask about lesbian lives. Their activism utilised a blend of playfulness and confrontation to make their audience consider their message. On Valentine's Day, they walked around Grand Central Station handing out chocolate kisses and announcing, "You've been kissed by a lesbian." Their goal wasn't just protest, it was visibility. They aimed to exist loudly in public spaces that so often erased them. They eventually produced the Lesbian Avenger Handbook, a handy guide to homemade revolution. A manual that balanced practical organising advice with their typical humour and charm. They say, what follows is concrete information on how to organise a direct action group. The more efficient your frameworks are, the more encouragement there will be for creative, imaginative work. We have left space in the margins throughout this handbook for you to add your own ideas, inspirations, and list of contacts. Go girl. If you want revenge, call a meeting. A meeting is the first step toward a life of retribution. The purpose is to make our demands known, win change, and involve as many lesbians as possible. Even though the group disbanded in 1997, their legacy endures. The Lesbian Avengers proved that revolution could be creative, imaginative, and thought-provoking, beyond just marching the streets. The Combahee River Collective were a collective of black feminists who began meeting in 1974. Named after Harriet Tubman's 1863 raid on the Combahee River, which liberated 750 enslaved people, the CRC's core focus was black resistance. Their mission was to centre the needs of black women and lesbians who were often marginalised within both the feminist and civil rights movements. In 1977, the group drafted the Combahee River Collective Statement, now a cornerstone of black feminist theory. Rejecting monolithic, single-issue politics, they highlighted how racism, sexism, homophobia, classism and imperialism were all issues which together shaped black women's oppression. While the term intersectionality had not yet been coined, this group undeniably took an intersectional approach to challenge mainstream feminism's focus on the experiences of white heterosexual women. The CRC explicitly rejected lesbian separatism, arguing that isolation from men ignored the complex realities of black women's lives, arguing that it was, quote, not a viable political analysis or strategy for them. In the CRC statement, they highlighted that, quote, we must also question whether lesbian separatism is an adequate and progressive political analysis strategy, even for those who practice it, since it completely denies any of but the sexual sources of women's oppressions, negating the facts of class and race. The CRC laid the foundation for intersectional feminism, influencing future feminist and queer activism, by insisting that, quote, if black women were free, everyone would have to be free. They challenged feminism and activism that did not work to dismantle all systems of oppression. In Britain, there were also a number of feminist groups, the most notable of which was the Leeds Revolutionary Feminist Group. This group was also a proponent of lesbian feminism, urging feminists to embrace lesbianism. They famously declared that feminists should, quote, remove men from your beds to your heads. Their controversial 1979 booklet, Love Your Enemy, The Debate Between Heterosexual Feminism and Political Lesbianism, argued that, quote, all feminists can and should be lesbians, with their definition of a lesbian being a, quote, woman-identified woman who does not sleep with men. It does not mean compulsory sexual activity with women. The manifesto sparked fierce debate, even among lesbians. Sheila Jeffreys, the booklet's primary author, later reflected that the backlash to the booklet was, quote, quite shocking. Many lesbians were furious with us. They felt we'd exposed them to hostility from heterosexual feminists. Unlike the Combahee River Collective, which rejected separatism as exclusionary, the Leeds group saw lesbianism as the only pure form of feminist resistance. The issue of lesbian separatism was central to disagreements between lesbian groups and across the feminist movement. The core challenge was whether complete separation from men, even for heterosexual feminists, was necessary for women's liberation. These tensions came from the radical lesbians Woman-Identified Woman and Charlotte Bunch's Lesbians in Revolt, which argued that lesbianism was not just a sexual identity, but a necessary feminist political rejection of patriarchy. Female separatism as a concept, though, wasn't new, with one 1992 Off Our Backs article arguing that, quote, there have been female and lesbian separatist movements throughout the history of heteropatriarchy. Separatists sought to create a culture that did not at all involve men, including communities, both physical and literary, distinct female and lesbian publications, and even changes in language that they believed would separate them from the domination of a male-centred, patriarchal society. This vision caused fierce debate and resistance, even within lesbian circles. For example, Arlie Scott, now's first openly lesbian vice president, was ousted from her position in 1980. Off Our Backs, a feminist and female-led publication, drew connections between her sexuality and her removal from the position, stating that there was, quote, a tremendous tension over lesbian visibility within mainstream feminist organisations. Many heterosexual feminists still viewed lesbianism as, quote, a psychological phenomenon and sexual perversion, rather than a valid political stance, as another Off Our Backs article noted. Many lesbians struggle to find the balance between their identity as women, feminists, and lesbians. Jenny Ruby noted in 1996 that, quote, feminism provides an analysis of what was wrong. Male dominance, hierarchy, financial and physical coercion, lack of equality, etc. And as a lesbian, feminism continues to help me understand what is better for me and what is worse. For many lesbians, feminism was a useful tool in understanding their oppression, whether or not they believed in separatism or inclusion. While one article in Off Our Backs in 1992 still defended separatism as, quote, an act of moving towards lesbian, life-loving reality, others questioned its political validity and use. The isolation of small, local and impoverished lesbian networks compared to the national, professionalised feminist network meant that in reality, lesbians had almost no choice as to whether they wanted to be included in mainstream feminism, choosing this over total invisibility. As you can see, there were plenty of lesbian feminist groups which shaped feminism and activism as a whole, many of which, aside from the Combahee River Collective, argued for lesbian separatism or lesbian feminism, where they believed women should stop sleeping with men, remove them from their heads to their beds, and become women-identified women. On the other hand, though, there was a community of lesbians who saw themselves as women first, and increasingly identified with the growing inclusion within the feminist movement.
In the spirit of '76, women are participating more fully in politics.
Workplace inequality is one area which both straight women and lesbians alike had to fight for their rights. In both Britain and the US, there was a long history of gender inequality in pay between men and women, with women earning significantly less than men and making up a much smaller percentage of the workforce. Beyond just financial disparities, though, there were a number of ways in which women were also discriminated against in the workplace, such as restrictive dress codes, hierarchical discrimination, and in some cases, sexual violence. Lesbians experienced these issues as well, and sometimes their identity would exacerbate their discrimination. For example, in the Women's Royal Army Corps in Britain, women were often subjected to interrogations if they were suspected to be lesbian. This could include having their letters and photographs seized, being repeatedly asked intimate questions, or being referred to psychiatrists for further questioning. In the US, at AT&T, one of the largest employers of women in the 1970s, women were often transferred or pushed out if suspected to be a lesbian. Strict dress codes were also enforced where women had to wear feminine attire, or could also face discrimination or firing by wearing masculine clothes. Feminists and lesbians alike began to fight back.
Today's vigorous movement for equal rights is coupled with the effects of economic growth and expanding technology. The women's role in the family is changing to meet these modern challenges, but these changes can be traumatic for those undergoing them because of a lack of perspective.
For example, feminists took AT&T to court for gender discrimination and won. The company was eventually required to take affirmative action and create a more diverse workforce. In 1989, 60,000 telephone workers stormed out of their jobs in New York and New England and stayed out for 17 weeks to protest the inequality. They organised women-only picket lines demanding equal pay for equal work, an end to gender-based job segregation, and protection for all female workers. The 9-to-5 movement similarly protested unfair treatment of women in the workplace, where feminists of all sexualities organised a variety of protests and a newsletter with anonymous testimonials about sexual harassment and homophobia in the workplace.
Not all women were picketing on the streets of the early 1970s. Many intellectualized from responsible positions.
During the latter half of the 20th century, we begin to see a unity across feminists of all sexualities and groups in order to fight for their shared experiences of discrimination in the workplace. Motherhood is another example of this shared struggle.
Now, the old family is not the kind that fits today, and we have to work out a new kind of family that fits today. And this isn't...
For straight feminists, much of their activism came as a challenge to the discrimination that mothers faced in the working world, struggling to receive raises or go beyond part-time due to a lack of childcare. For lesbians, there was the added struggle of their identity, making them legally and socially unable to adopt or raise children, and consistently losing custody battles against ex-husbands. For example, Sandy Schuster and Madeline Isaacson, who met and fell in love in 1970 Seattle, faced a near-decade-long custody battle with their husbands. They won custody, but were only allowed to keep their children if they lived separately. In protest, they moved one door down from each other. This eventually led to the creation of a community of lesbian mothers who supported each other and the creation of the Lesbian Mothers National Defence Fund. The difference in straight and lesbian issues of motherhood, however, did not stop them protesting shared rights. For example, the 1970 Strike for Equality was a nationwide demonstration in the US, and marks the 50th anniversary of women's suffrage, demanding equal rights, better childcare, and the right to abortion, and included both lesbian and straight feminists. While many straight feminists focused their protests on free childcare, abortion, reproductive rights, and an end to workplace discrimination against mothers, groups like the Radical Lesbians and the Furies attended, and additionally fought for alternative family structures, and used slogans such as "motherhood by choice, not force," to maintain their visibility within the community. While different in some aspects, lesbians and straight feminists shared the commonality of fighting for the rights of women as a whole, leading many lesbians to actively involve themselves in the feminist movement, and feminists eventually welcoming them into it.
Equal rights! When do we want them? Now! When do we want equal rights? When do we want them? Now! Now!
There are many more examples of this shared activism, moving even beyond the rights of women. For example, in Britain, the Greenham Common Women's Peace Camp from 1981 to 2000 brought together 30,000 women, including both lesbian separatists and straight mothers, to protest keeping US nuclear weaponry in the UK. The camp eventually became a powerful queer feminist space, and led to unity among women no matter their sexuality.
No longer theory, equality of rights for all, in the professions and in economic life, in politics, the arts, and in the community, is becoming a reality.
By the end of the 20th century, lesbians had found their place within the feminist movement more broadly, recognising their differences, but fighting for the shared oppression of women. The history of lesbians as a whole, but particularly within the feminist movement, is widely under-researched. As a group which has often actively been erased from narratives, finding sources, testimony, and information can be difficult. This documentary has charted the ways in which lesbians have shaped, challenged, and come together with the feminist movement. Due to the intersectionality of various lesbian identities, an exploration of lesbians within activist movements can help shed light on the experiences of different marginalised groups. As Miller argues, lesbian studies is an interdisciplinary perspective located at the intersection of women's studies and gay studies. But beyond this, the impact of groups like the Combahee River Collective cannot be understated in creating a more intersectional approach to activism. While there was a long history of struggle between lesbians and straight feminists, lesbians have radically changed the feminist movement as a whole, with some of the most influential, respected, and visible feminist writers being lesbians. As Gilmore and Kaminsky argue, it was not a foregone conclusion that members would accept lesbians' rights as women's rights. It was an active process of fighting for their inclusion and finding points of separation. Lesbians have historically proved a problem to feminism. Del Rio notes that, quote, "In asserting the right to live outside the nuclear family model, pursue their own careers and passions, and surround themselves with women, while also making womanhood central to their identity, lesbians challenge the very basis of sex categories." Over time, though, lesbian inclusion in the feminist movement led to a more powerful, influential, and intersectional women's liberation movement, which has been central to creating the rights that women have today. Without realising it, your perception of feminism has likely been vastly shaped by lesbian feminists and activists. For example, you have likely heard the term Bechdel test, but you may not know that the phrase was created based on a cartoon strip produced by Alison Bechdel, a lesbian, which outlined what a lesbian would want to see when they go to the cinema. I hope this documentary has shed light on the impact of this group, and you continue to consider other groups which are often hidden or pushed aside, but have shaped your lives through activism and protest. I think sort of now coming to the end of the process that has been making this documentary, which has been a long process of research and finding these stories and case studies which are quite difficult to find. They're quite hidden from our general perspective of feminism. It makes me think about all the people that have made huge impacts on our lives and we haven't even realised. And thinking about even feminism in general and the rights that as women we now have that we almost take for granted, like the right to an education and the right to vote. And, you know, it's still an active process, but workplace equality and those social changes, we can't take them for granted. And I think knowing these histories and exploring them and taking an intersectional approach to our understanding of them is really important just as people and women.
Equal rights! When do we want them? Now!
So I hope that you have learnt a lot from this documentary and feel like you now know more about the sort of hidden history of feminism, which is often not studied as much, and the impact that lesbians and non-white feminists have had this huge impact, and they're so often hidden from these narratives. Thank you for watching.